Do you want to start building an agent that can collect information from the internet for multiple customers, companies, or markets? In this video, I will explain step by step how you can build such an agent and use it for free using the Groq API and the Serper API in Microsoft Visual Studio Code. First, I will briefly explain what we actually mean by agents. Then I will show you how to build the agent in code. And finally, I will show you an example how you can start building a scalable agent that in one click can collect information for hundreds of companies, markets, or customers. So let's get started. So let me briefly explain what we mean when we talk about agents. So agents is kind of the next step in generative AI, where we can kind of outsource activities to agents who can act quite autonomously. So we will give agent a task and the agents themselves can execute it quite autonomously. And the great advantage of agents is that they can do it in a scalable way. That means that with one single click, the agents can do a particular task for multiple observations, like multiple customers, multiple markets, or even multiple companies. So that's what I will show you. And so in this video, I use as an example an agent that I call Robert. And Robert is actually an agent that I use at WHU. So we have a platform at WHU where we keep track of the founders. And this actually is done in collaboration with Dealroom. So in that platform, we have a lot of information about companies that have been founded by WHU alumni. And that platform provides a lot of information like funding rounds and all that kind of stuff that is publicly available. But the platform actually lacks a clear description for each company in the platform. And of course, that's for us quite important information. So here we use an agent to give us a detailed company description for each company on our platform. And let me explain you a bit how we built that agent. So we call this agent Robert. And so what is the function of Robert? We can give Robert an Excel with information about companies. And then Robert, based on that information, will go to the internet, scrape information, publicly available information, and based on that will create for us a company description. And let me briefly show the technical details that we need for creating this agent. So for this agent, we will use, again, Groq as the large language model. Why? Because here we can use kind of large language models for free, because via Groq we can access open source large language models. Then I will use Serper as a tool to allow Robert to go to the internet and search for information. So we will use Serper. And again, if you log in at Serper, I will show you how to do that. You can get quite some free credits, like 2000. So especially for your first experiments, Serper is a great opportunity because you will get some free credits, and then we can use the Serper API key to create a web search tool that will allow Robert to go to the internet and look for information. And finally, we have to give Robert instructions. And that actually means we simply have to provide Robert with a prompt that describes in detail what Robert needs to do. So in this case, and I will show the prompt in detail later on, we have created a prompt that will kind of instruct Robert on how to collect information and create a company description out of that. So these are the three things we need, and we actually have to bundle them in our code in one way or another. And in this case, I use the agent SDK of OpenAI. So this is the way how we will bring the model, the tool, and the instructions together in one agent that then can start executing tasks for us. So this is a brief overview of the technical things we need. And now I will show you how we can start build Robert in the coding. So here we are in Microsoft Visual Studio Code. And now to start building the agent, we will need now two API keys. The first API key that we will need is a Groq API key. And I stored my API key here in a groq.txt file. And now I have another video where I explain how to get a Groq API key if you've never done it. So then you can check out that video. I will have the link in the description. And we need also an API key from Serper. And let me briefly show you how you can get such an API key. So what you need to do is to go to serper.dev, to that website. Then you have to create a sign-in, for instance, with your Google email address or with another email address. You don't have to give any credit card information or something like that. And then here you can actually get your first 2,500 free queries. So then if you click on that, you will be able to create an API key, and that API key you can then store in a text file, and that's what we need for our Microsoft Visual Code to work. Yeah, so as you can see in my folder, I have my text file called serper.txt, so that's what I have here. And I also have an Excel with company information. So let me briefly show you how that Excel looks like. Yeah, so here you see an Excel with a column with company names. This column is called company name in Latin alphabet. Then I have the cities where the company is officially headquartered, and if available, I have their founding year. So this is the information that I have. Again, I will also provide this Excel with a link in the description so that you can use it for your first experiment. And this is what we need to start using info from an Excel that the agent can retrieve to look for company descriptions for these companies. Yes, so I have my two API keys, I have an Excel, and so here is my notebook. Again, I will share the notebook also in the description so that you can step-by-step execute it yourself. Now here we will have to install quite some packages. So I have listed here what you definitely will need to install is the OpenAI agents, the OpenAI agents Lite LLM, which will actually allow us to talk with the Groq platform. We have HTTPX that we need, pandas, tqdm. So these are the ones that you will have to install. It might actually be, depending on the configuration of your computer, that you need some additional packages. But that will become clear if you execute the cells. If you get an error message and it say, look, you need an additional package, please install it, then you need to install that by doing pip install whatever package you need. And in that way, you will have then all the packages necessary to execute. But so I already installed now all the packages, so I can just now press play. Yeah, so my packages are loaded. And now, again, I can read my Groq API key from the text file, and I can read my Serper API key from the text file. So let me do that so that they are ready. So that's now ready. And now the first thing we need to do, and this is simply a technical thing, because what we are doing is we'll use the OpenAI SDK, but we are actually not using the OpenAI large language models, because if you want to do that, you need to start paying for tokens. And of course, if you want to make that investment, that's perfectly okay, and that's quite convenient. But here I want to give you an option to start experimenting with these agents for free. So that's why we use the Groq platform. So we are not using an OpenAI large language model. And that's then why we have to write this: set tracing disabled is true. Yeah? So just this is something we need to avoid that we have errors later on. So this is a very technical thing, but now just trust me that you need to do that. And now the first thing we need to do is to create a tool. Yeah? So what we want is that Robert can go to the internet and actually, like a person, does Google searches to retrieve information about the company. And then we have to define a tool. And this is how we define a tool. So you say, we kind of define a function. So this is search internet, where we will give as input a query, a string, and as output we want to get a string. We can briefly describe here what it needs to do. Also here we just give a kind of description what it needs to do. Here we need to give the URL that it will use to search, and this is again related to Serper. So this is google.serper.dev search. We need to define some headers, and in the header we need to again provide our Serper API key. So we have defined our Serper API key before. So here I have defined the Serper API key, and so here in the tool we need to indicate the Serper API key so that it can really go to the internet and search. And then here we can give some additional information. And again, here you will be able to copy it from my notebook. But here important is the number of searches that the tool will be able to do. And here we put it to a maximum of 5. Because the more options you give it, the more it can search, the more tokens you will use. And I will come back to that later on. But to some extent, we have to make sure that we restrict token usage, because otherwise we might hit what is called rate limits, and then it will stop working. So here it will be able to do 5 searches, which in my experience is more than enough to get a good output. And here, and this is again more technical, just to make sure that everything works well. So this part of the code, just take it over to make sure that you will get the adequate output. Yeah. So this coding block we use to define a search tool that subsequently the agent can use. That's what we are doing here. Yeah? And then we actually are defining the agent itself. And that's you do as follows. So you say you give your agent a name. So in this case, I call it a company research agent. And then we need to define a number of things. So first of all, we need to give it a name. Yeah? So we can, again, and we can now just give it the same name as our variable. And then we give instructions. And here I actually provide my prompt. Yeah? In terms of a prompt describing what the agent needs to do. So here you can see that I'm saying you're a company analyst, you research the company using the search internet tool, and it needs to give information like founders, location, incorporation year, funding rounds, a company description, product offerings, and key activities. So that's kind of the output I wanted to search. And I give it here some additional instructions and make sure to use the search tool to search for information. And I want to have a JSON object as output, so that we have a kind of structured output. The model that we use, the large language model, I have to define now, and I do that as follows. So we use this light LLM model. This is just a way how to communicate. And here I formulate the model that I want. Yeah? And so I will use here from Groq a model from Llama, one of the recent ones called Llama for Scout. And let me now briefly explain why we use exactly this model. Yes, so now I'm at the console.groq.com. This is the place where we have been in other videos to build prompts. And now I can go to the documentation, and here I can go to something called rate limits. And this is actually quite important information because this indicates in the free model, so at the moment we are not paying for Groq, we are using the free one, so we can use models for free. But then there are restrictions to how much tokens you can use. And there are a number of restrictions, so it's about how many requests can you do per minute. So how often can you ask the large language model to do something per minute? How often can you do it per day? How much tokens can you use per minute? How much tokens can you use per day? These are actually the 4 important metrics that are relevant for our agent, Robert. And especially an important one is the tokens per minute. Yeah? So how much tokens can the agent generate per minute? Because here you might indeed face a risk of rate limits. So what we want to do is we want to select a model that allows us to have quite some tokens per minute, because this agent will be quite consuming in terms of tokens. Yeah? So let us take a look now at the rate. So we're in the free plan, and then we can see here, so requests per minute, but most importantly for us is at the moment tokens per minute. So here we want to have quite some tokens, and you will see that, for instance, the Metaphor Scout allows you to have 30,000 tokens. So this is actually quite an interesting model to use here. And on a daily basis, you can do 500,000 tokens. So in that way, for first experiments, this is actually a good model to use. So that's why I use this model. Yes, so this is why we have defined the model. And here I then have also to define my Groq API key, which I have entered before. So this is why I need to mention this here. And then finally, I need to explain my agent, which tools we are using. And in this case, we use one particular tool, and that's the search internet tool that I have defined before. So as shown you before, here we have defined the search internet, and now I'm indicating to the agent that that's the tool it can use. Yeah? And in this way, we have defined the agent. So this is the code that you need to define an agent using a specific large language model, giving it a particular tool, and giving it specific instructions. These are the 3 things we need to provide. And then we can actually define how to execute this agent. So this is a code block to actually run the agent. And the one thing we now need to add is our input. And our input we give as a variable that we call prompt. So now I'm mentioning here, can you please help me to collect information for the following company? And here I already define a variable that I call company input. So in the end, the agent will then read the input that we will provide, add it to this prompt, and then based on the instructions, it will execute the agent. And the actual execution of the agent will be done in this way. So you say, look, as output, I want to run the agent with as input the prompt. Yeah? So I have two variables here. So I run the agent that I've defined in the prior code block, and we use here the prompt that I define here. And so then it has to return me the output. So I've created here a function that as output should give me the output of running the agent. You mentioned here that it mentions async. This has to do, this is very technical, this has to do with the agent SDK and that I use a Jupyter notebook. So you need to run code blocks async, otherwise you would get errors. But again, just take that over. This is a very technical issue. Yes, so now we have defined how to run the agent. And now what I will do is I will actually read my Excel in my coding block. I get now an error message. That's probably because the Excel is still open in my file. So now I briefly have to go to my Excel, close it, and then I can run it again. And now we get not an error message anymore. Then I want to read the columns. So these are the columns of my Excel. And let's double check. So we have 5 companies, 4 columns. That makes sense. And in this coding block, what I do now is I just, for the first observation in my Excel, yes, and so what I do here now is actually to create an input string, and this will be the input information that we provide. And what information do I want to provide? I want to give the name of the company that it needs to search for and the location. And so here from my data, I just pick from the column name, the first observation. So here I will have the name of my company, and then I add already saying, and now I will give you the location. And then I add again the city of the company, and I even add again as text that it's in Germany. So here I create one single string saying the company name, saying location, and then it will give the city, and also I mentioned Germany. So that should be sufficient input for the agent to then start a search. Yeah? So this is the input string that I define. And we can briefly print it out so that you can see the results. So indeed, the first observation is a company that is called like this, and the location is the city in Germany. Yeah? So that's now my input string. And now the only thing I need to write is, okay, I want to get a result. And the result is that you need to execute my research company function with this input string. And if we go back, the research company function, if we go up, that's here where I defined how to execute the agent. And so now we can simply say, execute the agent with this particular input string. So now I press play, and now the agent starts working. And this will typically take like a number of seconds. We are now ready. So it worked for 3.6 seconds. And now I can play results. And now we can see what the result is. And you see I get now a long object. So this is kind of the output that the agent is giving. It's a very long object with all the information. Yeah? So what is the input? How many searches did it do? How much tokens did it use? And in the end, of course, also this description should be there. So now I have to kind of extract that information from my result object. And so how do I do that? I just say, okay, I now want to get my information, and that is situated in the result object called the final output. Yeah? So that's where I can find that, and then I want to print it out. And on top of that, I actually also want to know how much tokens did it take to generate this, so that I have an indication about how much tokens it's using, and that I can do by extracting from this object results.contextWrapper.usage.total tokens, and then I can print that out. So let's now run this block, and then we can see the results. And you see here, this is my output. So indeed, I get a JSON object where it could not find the founders for this company. It confirmed kind of the city, country, and founding year. It could not find information about funding, but here you see that indeed it was able now to create for me an extensive company description. And that's what I wanted. And it also created a description of the company offerings. So based on searching for the internet, it was not able to find some information. And then it's actually good that it says, look, I could not find it. And here it actually gives me now a description and an offering. Yeah, so now we have done it for one single company. Of course, what I want in the end is that I can, with one single click, can do this for multiple companies. And so in this Excel, we have 5 companies. So now I want to do this for all 5 companies in one single click. And let me show you how we can do that. So now here is kind of the coding block that will allow me to create a loop, what we call a for loop, that will do the same agent execution for all the companies in my Excel sheet. And so here I have created a start point and an end point. So just to make sure that it does that for 5 companies. Why do I do this? Here it's not that very relevant, but imagine that you have an Excel sheet with 1,000 companies. Now, if you first experiment it, you don't want to immediately run that prompt for 1,000 companies, because then you're using a lot of tokens and your Serper API will do a lot of searches, so very quickly you will run out of credits. Yeah? So especially if you start experimenting, make sure to restrict in a for loop how many observations it processes, because otherwise you might really be consuming a lot of tokens immediately. And this becomes even more important if you start paying for tokens, because then you have to be more careful. Here we are only using free tools, so not a lot of disasters can happen, but of course, if you start paying for tokens, you have to be even more careful about this. So that's why I define a start point and an end point. I create an empty list in which we will add all the information that is generated by the agent. And then I create a for loop. Here in the for loop, you see this tqdm. What does that mean? This is simply some additional information that allow me to follow up how many observations the agent already processed. Yeah? So then I can just monitor how much observations have been processed. So this is just a helpful tool to do some monitoring. And then again, I have my input string. But now instead of saying observation 0, I will say here observation E, because I have created a loop here with for E in the loop. So then for every element in E, it needs to create that input string every time again. And then it needs to try to execute my agent. So here I just have rewritten the execution of my agent, and then it needs to get the information out of it. That's what I want. And when it extracts the information, it needs to add that to my list so that I have the information. If for one way or another the agent fails to execute, if you have a loop, there can always be errors emerging. So then it should actually add an error message to my list so that I know that for that observation, it has not been able to retrieve information. Finally, you also see here that I add at the end of the loop something, say, await synq.sleep10. And that means after it has executed one run, so it does it for one company, I want it to wait for 10 seconds until it does for the next observation. Why do I do that? Again, to reduce the risk that I will hit a token limit. Otherwise, it will start immediately executing, but then it could collect so many tokens in one single run that actually we might hit a limit. So if we go briefly back up again to see how many tokens we have used, here I printed out total tokens. Now we did 3,223 tokens. So, and you might remember we have a rate limit of 30,000 tokens per limit. But so if it would very quickly start executing, see it only took 3 seconds here to execute that. So you might have a risk that when we are at company 10, it hits a rate limit and then it will stop. Now, anyway, this is not possible here because I only do 5 companies. But if you go for a scalable solution, you need to kind of add some sleeping time to make sure that you don't hit these rate limits. So that's the technical part here. Yeah? So now we can execute this part. Yeah? And so now we can just press on play. And the moment I press on play, it will start executing the for loop and it will automatically collect the information for the 5 companies. So now I press on play. And now we can go down. And now here indeed, you can see that I can follow up where in the loop it is working. So now it's collecting information for the first company. So we now have to wait. That's now finished. So it did now 20% of the job because we did our first company. And now we have to wait. And remember that we now always build in a sleeping time of 10 seconds. So that means we have to wait a bit more. And that's a kind of trade-off you're facing. So the more sleeping time you build in, the less likely you are to hit rate limits, but of course the longer it will take to execute your for loop. So that's kind of the trade-off you have to play with. And in this case, I think 10 seconds was a good balance. for other things, you might have more sleeping time or less sleeping time. That's something you have to experiment with a bit. Yeah? So we are actually almost ready. Yeah? We did already 4 out of 5. So now we're almost at 100%. So let us briefly wait now. Yes, so now I reached 100%. So now I can double check. So in my overview list, I should now have 5 observations. So let me run. And indeed, I have 5 observations. And now I can double check and, for instance, print out what has been generated for the 4th observation. So let me print that out. We can double check now. And indeed, I find now a description for Jupyter, and that's the company it has now identified. Let me double check now, for instance, for 1. Yes. And again, we find some indications here. And again, you see that sometimes it does not find information. And this is here quite logical because the companies actually are quite old companies. So this is not really the typical startup companies with funding and stuff like that. So that it doesn't find some information is okay. It's actually better than that it would make up information here. So already hallucination seems to be quite limited. And again, you see that every time I get a nice company description and a nice description of the company product offerings. And then I can simply transform this list into a new column and then save that column to my Excel. So this is the coding to do so. So now I can press enter. And now we should be able to see the Excel. So let me briefly show that to you. Yes, so and here is my updated Excel. And you see now indeed that for every company, it has created for me a description. Now, what you can see here is that at the moment, the format is not yet standardized. Yeah? So for some, it gives me simply some text as a JSON. For others, it's immediately the JSON file. So this is something that I will need to fine tune if I then really want to start using that information in the next steps. But for now, I hope that at least you can see that it has been able in a very short amount of time to find me information about these companies that I wanted by one single click. Yeah? So that's how you can build a scalable agent. Now, in an upcoming video, I will explain you a bit more how you can make sure that you have a very nice structure so that you can then easily use that information. So there are still risks that it will find information that is not really relevant. So hallucination is still an issue. So I will also explain you in an upcoming video how you can further reduce the risk of hallucination by, on the one hand, improve the prompt, but by the other hand, actually build a team of agents where we will have an additional agent that will double check the information. So if you're interested in that, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Make sure that you have the alert when new videos emerge, because then you will be able to further optimize this web scraping agent. Okay, I hope this was helpful for you. Please let me know how your experiments went and hope to see you again for another video. Thanks a lot. Bye.